Okay. So yeah, if
Wanted
people
to
show up
ask,
a little,
did you start, is there like a bulleted agenda just
no,
for, okay.
I apologize.
No,
Yeah,
no apology necessary. I just want to make sure I didn't miss it. And
so what, yeah, I sent around, and I'm not proud of it. I sent around a document that talked about cross-cutting issues, and then, the biodiesel topic and the wood topic. But yeah, that's partly, this is, there is so much. Um, so I guess I was going to start off and kind of frame some topics, but I want to get people's reactions. I sent a lot of stuff and I want people's reactions, and I'm just kind of hoping that those reactions will lead us to, oh, this is where we want to kind of to summarize for today. We're not going to come to any sort of conclusion today. No presumption, but anyway. So one of the things that while I was awake last night, um, I think is important because I'm still struggling with it, is, the statute talks about determining credit values based on life cycle analysis, life cycle assessment of emissions. Right now, my thinking that the work that ANR, that I circulated, the work that ANR did on upstream emissions for a significant list of fuels, if you add that to, especially for the fossil fuels, if you add that to the fossil fuel combustion figure, kilograms of carbon per million BTU, that to me is a definition of life cycle assessment based emissions. But what it doesn't do, and where we're going to continue to have the challenge, is what we do about biogenic sources that, and Brian sent around the note about how wood has been dealt with in the inventory, and kind of translating what the statute, because ultimately we need to assess the impact on the inventory, that we could very well just say wood is zero, because wood is captured, at least in Vermont, in the assessment of carbon within the different land use categories. But what I say, where it gets really tricky, and I think a focus in terms of the wood topic, is wood pellets. Most wood pellets do not come from Vermont. And biodiesel, essentially all biodiesel, especially if we ramp up our utilization, is not going to come from Vermont. So so that's what makes life cycle assessment based values not fully capture the issues of our bioenergy needs. So I just wanted to throw that out, and if people have sort of if they hear what I say and say, no, there's something fundamentally wrong with that, please let us know. And then we can go to some of the assessment products that are out there, in part the upstream analysis, but also the carbon intensity pieces from California and Oregon. So that's where I am. And so to introduce ourselves, if people want to say how they want to react and how they want to move forward today, that would be great. Go ahead, Brian. You're still muted.
yes, I am, for the benefit of folks that might know me. I'm Brian Woods from the Agency of Natural Resources Climate Action Office. So Ken, I heard you say that the life cycle analysis that was done by ERG, commissioned by ANR, didn't account for upstream emissions from fuels that were from out of the state.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
I'm saying that represented the upstream emissions, okay?
Right.
But what I'm saying, where it gets complicated, is when we have, and I guess this goes to the actual combustion figure, the combustion of the product in Vermont, the difference between a fossil fuel combustion, where, those numbers are pretty well established, and the combustion of let's say, a biodiesel, where in order for us to assess it, we need to allocate, or, we can establish it at zero, but I had that as a different piece. What I was saying is for the fossil fuels, my understanding is life cycle assessment equals the combustion emissions plus the upstream emissions. That's kind of the definition. And it gets complicated when you look at the bioenergy sources.
Okay, I agree with that statement.
Okay. Mary.
I'm a member of the public, so I don't know if I'm actually allowed to speak here.
Yep, probably. If I'll give you 15 seconds.
Well, the IPCC says you should not treat bioenergy as having zero emissions just because it's accounted in the land sector.
And I got
And
that, and we will
so-
definitely be discussing that. That there's yes,
But that's
we
not
will be
compatible
discussing
with
that.
what you just said. You said we could count it as zero because it's already been accounted in the land sector. That's what I heard you say. And in fact, the IPCC explicitly warns not to do that, except for national level accounting, which is the only place where that's appropriate.
Okay, and we will definitely talk about this, but what I was talking about is the method within the inventory. That is how the inventory does it. I'm not saying that's how we're doing it, because I'm very aware of this legislation and the issues raised with zeroing out wood in particular. So very aware of that. I was just talking the way the inventory calculates it is to zero it out. I'm not saying that is the way that it will ultimately be done. But thank you for raising that. We will be dealing with that again.
So
Patrick?
Can I suggest, though, as just a general matter, that I should have said this before we went to breakout groups. I think that the tag members should have priority in the discussion. Yep. If their time allows, then the public could weigh in, just like we do in the rest of the meeting.
Understood.
Great. Thanks for that, Catherine. Totally agree. So, can I agree with your statement that when you're calculating life cycle emissions, the combustion emissions get taken into account as well as the upstream emissions, and that it's more complicated for biogenic fuels, bioenergy in general? There was a different part of your statement that I'm not sure I understood about how that is related to the Vermont inventory. And I don't think that's something we need to consider, except to the extent that because our charge is to focus on the life cycle factors, except to the extent that whatever methodology is determined to calculate the life cycle factors, the life cycle emissions, will need, for fuels that are produced in Vermont, will need some emissions factors that are relevant to fuels produced in Vermont. But I don't, unless I've missed something, it doesn't seem like a good use of our time to be trying to reconcile the Vermont inventory with the life cycle methodology. We should just focus on the life cycle methodologies, because many of the fuels, the fossil fuels and the bioenergy fuels, are going to originate from outside the state.
Thank you. We might want to agree early on with that statement, with a recognition to the full tag that at some point that reconciliation of the inventory and the life cycle and assessment values will have to happen. But I think I agree with you, and look to the rest of the group. We shouldn't do that. We should stick with life cycle, but again, with an acknowledgement to the full group that at some point in this process, there has to be a reconciliation, because when we establish credit numbers, which is down the road, those credits ultimately are going to be the success of the clean heat standard process is going to be its impact on the inventory. But yeah, I think it makes our work a lot easier if we stick with the life cycle analysis.
Can I just respond to that, Floyd, if that's right? It's just seeing your hands up, but it seems to me the reconciliation should be at this point limited to how the technical consultants calculate the life cycle emissions for different fuel pathways, not how and ultimately, once those values are determined, and each fuel pathway has a carbon intensity value, that will be, for simplicity, multiplied by the volumes of each of those fuels combusted in Vermont, which may or may not inform how the inventory is done in the future. But that will be up to probably Brian and others who are determining the inventory to do that reconciliation then. That's just my assumption. And Brian or anybody else, if that seems wrong, would love to hear that.
So if it's okay, let's follow through on this discussion. So Sam, I think you had your hand up. Was it on this particular, or yeah, okay? And Floyd, do you want to talk about this particular topic?
I do too, but Floyd had his up first.
Right. Okay, so Floyd.
Yeah. Floyd Vergara, consultant for Clean Fuels Alliance America. I agree wholeheartedly with what Patrick said. I'm getting the sense that we may be kind of overthinking this a little bit. It seems like the charge of the group, as Patrick mentioned, was to look at the life cycle part of it and translate that into credit calculations. And the inventory we should keep as a separate, but as you said, Ken, it needs to be reconciled at some point. I don't think that reconciliation is that difficult. The West Coast states certainly do that. I mean, these issues are not, I don't think, are unique to Vermont. I mean, California imports the vast majority of a lot of its different alternative fuels, and they're not generated within the state. And so I think if we focus on the life cycle, calculation and how to do that correctly, I think we'll make much more progress. And in that sense, when you do a GREET type of life cycle calculation, you're taking upstream and combustion into account, because you're adding up all of those steps in the life cycle, and you're doing that whether it's the upstream is out of state or within the state. It's all done there. So I don't see that as a particularly unique situation to Vermont. I mean, GREET may not have pathways for wood, but GREET is like a open source spreadsheet. I mean, I think you can modify it to do that sort of calculation with the right inputs. So I'll just leave it at that and just kind of agree with what's been said. I think and just try to simplify what we're looking at, and not conflate the inventory issue versus the life cycle issue. The way the West Coast deals with it is they do inventory pursuant to IPCC, and they keep track of the biogenics separately, but that doesn't stop them from giving credits under their low carbon fuel standard programs, right? And each of those credits represents a metric ton of carbon reduced, and that's going to be experienced by the atmosphere regardless of how the paperwork inventory is done. So I think we ought to keep those in mind. It's we're not cheating the atmosphere of anything by doing things on a life cycle basis. We're actually putting things on a level playing field and making sure that each of these different alternative fuel pathways are assessed on an equal footing the same framework for doing that assessment, so that we're looking at things evenly. And the calculation itself is not that difficult. I mean, I volunteered earlier to show how that's done, but it's really, you're just, if your carbon intensity is above or below the declining standard, then you're gonna be generating a credit or a deficit, and then the calculation takes into account, as Patrick said, the volume of the fuel that's used or combusted, and then conversion factor, and then you factor in the relative efficiency of that fuel used, and then that's pretty much it. I mean, there's not much more to it than that.
Okay.
Anyway, I'll stop it there and
yeah. Okay, I think Sam.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just mainly agree with what Floyd said. Those are the points that I would make too, and definitely agree that focusing on just getting the right life cycle values, which again shouldn't be too difficult because the models already exist, and ways of reconciling the inventories of a program versus a state also do exist, although we don't have to address that yet. I think that's the right order, right? Look at the life cycle CI scores first, and maybe come to some sort of a consensus or list of options in this group for that, and then later we can talk about reconciliation with the inventory. I guess one point that I would just add there, right, is the reason for following established methodology in places like the West Coast isn't just that, it's easy, right? But it should be kind of easy. It's also that they've put a lot of thought and effort into this, and it is a very well established and standardized practice, right? And if you look at across the board, one of the biggest pushes in the renewable energy industries is a standardized life cycle accounting and standardized carbon accounting practices, right? I mean, it's what the SEC is trying to do with using, standing up the GHG protocol from WRI as one of the main ways of doing this. So I would just agree and say that there's more reason than just, hey, this is easy to follow that method, right? We should try to standardize this program with other programs that will allow for the best markets to be created for these different technologies, whether it's a fuel or whether it's, a solar powered heat pump or whatever technology you're using for clean heat.
Okay, thanks. Is it Brian next?
And I agree that the focus of this group can be on determining these life cycle emissions. I'm wondering those, like, yes, that other step of then turning those life cycle emission reductions into a budget or a credit requirement that's achieves the Global Warming Solutions Act target in 2030. If we're not doing that, I don't know who is. Is that the pacing group? And that's that again is a non-trivial exercise. So I guess I'm happy to focus on the life cycle work initially, but I'm not ready to dismiss that second part of the work because I'm not sure who else would actually do that. And it does have a lot of implications to the program implementation. I think a lot of the comments that we've been hearing about life cycle, I agree with you, Floyd. What they do in California, out in the West Coast, is exactly right. They deal with the carbon intensity with a separate program. That's not happening here, right? This is an attempt to deal with an individual fuel sector and to try and roll all of this stuff, carbon intensity and emissions reduction, like gross emissions reductions, all into one. And that is what is making it complicated. So if it's broken out, I think it is a simpler activity, but I think it's still not simple. And the way it's laid out here, I think it adds some additional complexity. And then regarding carbon intensities in general, I think a lot of what we heard Floyd and Sam say applies to liquid biofuels that are coming from out of state. But I go back to what you said, Ken, that this becomes much more complicated to start assigning life cycle emission factors for solid wood combustion. The difference between pellets and chunk wood, and how are the stands being managed, and all those things that go into that are potentially, more Vermont specific. And then finally, going back to what Patrick, you said, this exercise is not going to be about whether or not ANR changes the inventory methodology. The legislature decided that we're doing what we're doing, and they set the GWSA targets based upon the methodology that we are using. Our team makes extraordinary efforts to try and every year improve that methodology, to provide supplemental information. This year, you're going to see this life cycle work go into it to acknowledge the the things that the core methodology does not acknowledge. But the outcome of this work is not to inform the agency's change, wholesale change to the methodology. We have these targets. They're based on the inventory, like them or not. The inventory can get better, but our job here is to say, okay, in this sector, with this fuel mix, with these assigned emissions on a life cycle basis, what's required of responsible parties to be able to achieve the 2030 emissions target that's counted in a different way.
So Brian, if I hope this meets your needs. The department Public Service Department put out a draft approach for the reconciliation. This is where the whole thing about measure mix came in. So if we restrict our discussions here to the life cycle, and again, acknowledging that there does have to be that reconciliation, and it's going to be based in part on on a draft measure mix, does that work for us? Can we do that? But acknowledge and communicate to the rest of the tag, hey, we have to follow through on that we being the full tag and maybe a subgroup, on doing a reconciliation that is going to be based on a measure mix. And one of the things is, fortunately, we don't have to meet a target until 2030 because we don't have to deal with the 2025 target. We're not going to get it right. Okay, so the early stages of those steps put out by the Public Service Department will be speculative, but it will do a reconciliation that then, as we get results coming in and a true mix of measures is begun in the first obligation years, then we can go back and adjust the reconciliation. And then, and only then can we then adjust the obligation numbers. We're going to have to come up with our first obligation numbers on, I'll call it a hypothetical, on using, because the measures won't be in place, and therefore we won't know the specific relationship between the life cycle assessed value of carbon emissions and the inventory based. But again, so the Public Service Department has written down, this is what we've got to do. We need to say, yes, somebody, not this group, somebody is going to have to do that probably a few months down the road when we have a draft measure mix to apply the different assessed values. Is that going to allow us to keep moving?
Well, no, I think we can keep moving. Like I said, I'm all in on trying to figure this out. I'm not ready to say this group doesn't do that second part. And the only thing I would say is that we don't. The PUC needs to pick what the ultimate methodology and the measure mix is. So we might want to consider not just one. Here's a range of possible outcomes, and here's, because you're right. Whatever ultimately gets implemented will not be what actually happens, and there will need to be adjustments. But a more robust way to approach the problem and to make a recommendation would be to say, let's not just look at one. Let's look at this range of possibilities going forward and present that, potentially with a recommendation for one over another.
Yep, that sounds good. And I do think the biggest variable in that is going to be biodiesel, renewable diesel, and maybe renewable natural gas too. I just don't know enough about that, the trajectory on that topic. But the existence of literally billions of gallons of renewable diesel and biodiesel that Vermont could tap into is going to be a big variable. do we get a lot of that or do we get a little of that? And the difference between the inventory based and the life cycle based is going to be a significant number. So I don't know, Sam, are you next? I'm not very good at tracking who's who and who's next.
Yeah,
So
thanks, Ken. You just wanted to respond to Brian's point. I mean, yeah, I do think this group does have to solve some of the reconciliation issues in the long run. If I can make, I guess, a suggestion on, I'm still sort of struggling with like what our deliverable is back to the rest of the tag on this, but maybe one of the deliverables that we could provide is sort of a high level roadmap on, the different steps that need to be taken in order to get us to a point where we have life cycle emission analyses, rough analyses, and we have a target, right, based on those. My understanding is, well, let me say this. My view on how it could work, and would love to hear, from Brian, especially if you think this is totally off base on what's possible. We figure out, what type of model we want to use, or, that assesses all resources equally, right? Whether it's GREET or something else. We bring that back to the modeler. They model multiple scenarios that would use those life cycle scores to reach the target, right? Based on an economic analysis combined with the GHG analysis. Then you would set the target based on those different pathways, right? And in setting that target, you need to then sort of back calculate what the point of use emissions are from the different technologies, I think. But does that make sense? I mean, is that like a reasonable set of steps, or am I totally off base there, right? I mean, we make a suggestion on the life cycle accounting methodology. The consultant uses that to then make projections that would inform the target. And then we can, help think through and support a target.
Yeah, it makes sense to me, but I'll let others kind of. So I see Floyd's up.
I would agree with most of what Sam just said. The only change I would suggest is that the target, it sounds like from what Brian was saying, the target is set by statute. And I'm not certain about that, but the target is set by statute. And so the deliverables for us is to identify the correct life cycle tool to use, and whatever other sort of modeling considerations need to be done, get that target from PUC or whoever from the statutorily driven provision, and then identify the slope using the sort of different scenarios that Brian suggested, least cost, least carbon, whatever the approaches you want to, or scenarios you want to model, and then that presumably will give you different slopes towards the same target, right? And then you can add in, you can fold in additional considerations, lower slope to build in more time, lead time for technologies and markets to develop, and then with a little bit steeper slope towards the target, but you're still getting to that same target, whatever that target is. But I'm not sure that the target itself is for the tag. I think how to get there and what tool to get there is kind of our main deliverable. But I welcome anyone else's thoughts on that.
And this clearly overlaps with the work the non-convening pacing group is having this very discussion. It's how do you establish that ramp? And they also are having the starting point and translating the statutory target. So yeah.
And I agree, Floyd. I sort of misspoke there. That's right. I agree.
Hey, Patrick.
I'm generally in agreement with Sam and Floyd, and I guess just want to ask if all of the tag members if we have some consensus around that, can we move on now to some of the other questions raised.
Yeah.
And looking at your topics for discussion, I'm not going through them sequentially, but the question I want to bring up the question of whether cordwood is a potential candidate for clean heat credits, because
Sure.
it's a complicated question, and I wonder if the answer is sort of simple, which would, if so, would simplify a lot of things. And I think that the statute allows for clean heat measures from advanced wood heating. I don't know how advanced wood heating is designed, and assuming I had on my computer the most recent is defined, and assuming I had on my computer the most recent version of the statute, I don't think it is defined, which is disappointing. But in general, I think it seems practical to say that cordwood is not an advanced wood heating measure.
Yeah, but and I agree with that cordwood may not fit under advanced wood heat, but I'll say the problem, that our additional challenge for us is that statute also opens the possibility of using other measures that help us reduce carbon. So if we take cordwood as being, and develop a carbon intensity value for it, and it's something that if someone converted from a fossil fuel product to a cordwood with a carbon intensity value lower than that fossil fuel, could that be a measure? And I also say the answer being no makes our lives a lot easier, and may have some political benefits as well, and also programmatic. Who's going to be designing a program to sell wood stoves? Yeah, there's a lot of issues there, but it's not an obvious no. That's one reason I put it there. But if we want to come back and say for the list of reasons why maybe we shouldn't be considering cordwood, I'm glad to forward that discussion along.
Can we propose that as a question to the PUC, or some other process here to clarify that and say, what is the intent of the statute regarding cordwood?
I don't think the PUC would be able to answer that.
Well, Deirdre has her hand up. She might have some insights.
Deirdre.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in because I think this is a valuable conversation, but the way I believe we're treating this is to have Opinion Dynamics, a technical consultant, to develop the measure list of essentially the things that are in statute and the permutations of those things. And that's should be forth, coming in the next week or so. And for us to share that with TAG, and for TAG to say, hey, it's missing this permutation of this technology, or but that it's really not, well, I just didn't want you to kind of go down this probably really potentially long conversation without having that in front of you and being able to react to something.
That sounds good.
Okay.
Adam.
Yeah, so in terms of, first, Adam Sherman with VEIC. Advanced wood heating under the Clean Energy Development Fund's incentive programs, it does include cordwood 2020 NSPS compliant wood stoves. So cordwood is under the table, on the table as an option, if you look at the consistency between incentive programs, how that maps to definition in this. I think it's a good, important question. I'll just say that there is precedent for the inclusion of cordwood under the term of advanced wood heating.
Okay, thanks. I should know that, see I'm on Clean Energy Development Fund board, but okay, Floyd.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that we should try to avoid presuming particular pathways are not viable in terms of carbon intensities. I think we haven't done the calculations yet. And so I think that's an initial kind of threshold question. You know, how do we do the life cycle assessment? And then once that's done, what does it say? And then based on the statute or other considerations, you know, how do we then continue to refine that list into measures that could work under this, rather than starting off with a list of, well, this measure is not going to work because of this and that. It seems to me I would like to see what the science says about every, you know, feasible pathway, and then go from there, right? I mean, there may be, you know, the calculations may show that a pathway we thought wasn't viable is actually pretty viable and carbon favorable, and something that we ought to consider. And if the statute says otherwise, then perhaps a recommendation from the tag is to go back to the legislature and have them reconsider that. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. But seems to me the charge of the group is to see what the science says, right? And that's what I'm most interested in, is rather than culling out you know, pathways from the get-go. Let's see what the science says, and then start doing these modeling scenarios to see which pathways can get us to particular policy objectives as quickly as possible at the lowest cost and all of that good stuff.
So I have a question for Deirdre. It's related to the consultants. So you know, our discussion has a lot to do with the identification of carbon intensities for different fuel pathways. Is that explicitly within the work of the contractor for the PUC? And similarly, do we know the Public Service Department's contractor in terms of the potential study? Are they specifically going to develop carbon intensities for Vermont, or maybe utilize them? But yeah, help us, because you know we're not going to be able to do a lot of this work, and to the extent that the consultants are already going to do it, that's great. We don't even have to pose questions to them. But if there needs to be some guidance, that's one of the reasons this group exists, is to make sure that the consultants are developing the products that are going to be most useful.
So just speaking kind of candidly, so we talked to Opinion Dynamics last week about what's in their scope beyond this measure characterization, what's going to go in the technical reference manual, and confirming that they're also doing the emissions schedule, which, you know, and this is some misunderstanding on my part, like carbon intensity, it seems like it would be input there to the emissions schedule. So to me, that is yes. The answer is yes, that it is squarely in their scope. But if this group can formulate questions for them to say, you know, that might even be really useful to do, just to make sure that understanding is clear, that what they're developing. And so I don't know if that's helpful, but yes, I mean, I think that's in their scope.
Okay, and as these weeks progress, as we get some updates on their work, we'll get a sense of the direction they're going on, things like carbon intensity.
Yeah.
And the measure, you're right, that measure list is going to be really important for us. That's going to be great. Thank you. Patrick.
I'll just add. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, Matthew. Yeah, go.
I was going to say, for the potential study, the contractor is also developing carbon intensity values so that they can project how the program would achieve its goals under GWSA. And so that will include a carbon intensity for Vermont's specific wood sector and their estimation of what Vermont's biofuel sectors will look like. The plan, as stated in the response to questions from a few tags ago, is to use GREET for the most part, and then modify it accordingly based on the feedstocks available to Vermont in particular, as well as the pathways by which those feedstocks are brought in to be used as fuels.
And do you think they'll be dealing with multiple versions of wood, as in pellets, cordwood, and chips?
I don't want to speak for them. We can ask them to provide that specific detail, but I would imagine that it's just as reflected in, let's say, the annual wood report from Vermont that describes the proportionality of cordwood use, pellet use, chip use, etc.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Patrick.
Sorry, I forgot my hand was still up.
Oh, then,
That
okay.
that said,
Then-
if we're ready, could go on to another question, but I
Yeah,
wanna
yeah. The one that I have is to the extent you folks have either in your past or as the result of me sending stuff out this week, we see carbon intensity work from different projects. California and Oregon were the ones I sent out. Is there anything that struck you from those that we need to, I'll say, be aware of, that it raised differences that we have questions about? Or are those just really good examples that we could say, yeah, we can do that too? Now, Patrick, your hand is up.
Yeah, I did put it back up. I can respond to that.
Yeah.
I think the simple answer is we can do that too, because those are derived from GREET. In part, they are derived from GREET. They are also informed by other modeling outside of GREET, like the impacts of land use change, and go into your question about, do GREET type analyses consider the alternate use of agricultural land? That is other analysis that those programs have done outside of GREET, which I know Floyd has way more expertise on than I do. And also just appreciate, Floyd, your offer to walk the group through some of the methodologies that were used on another tag meeting in a couple weeks. Sounds like a great idea to inform some of that. And I'll say that some of I believe the Oregon spreadsheet you sent is Oregon's default carbon intensity scores, whereas the California spreadsheet you sent is actual approved carbon intensity scores for specific pathways under the CARB program. And under those specific pathways, you can have substantially different carbon intensity scores depending upon many factors associated with those pathways.
Yep.
And so that is something that I think the technical consultants need to take into consideration, is for certain pathways, the particulars of not just accepting like the default for dairy and swine RNG of -150, because it may not apply in Vermont. If from biomethane produced in Vermont from Vermont farms, it might be more relevant to biomethane produced in other places. But it's just like, that is one example, is a very coarse value that's just a default. So
Thank you. Floyd.
And to that point, I think there is, as shown on the West Coast, there is utility for having a set of default values, as well as these bespoke values that Patrick is mentioning. When you have strong market signals and carbon pricing signals, you send a strong signal to innovate and further lower carbon reductions. This isn't the renewable fuel standard at the federal level. You have a continuum of carbon intensities, and you send that strong signal, people will innovate, producers will innovate and find ways to further reduce their carbon intensity. So I think it's important to make sure that we consider a program that has both a default value for those who don't want to bother making changes to their production process and settle on a default value, versus those who will take that and actually make changes that will further the policy objectives of the state.
Well, and to me, that raises the question is, as the clean heat standard gets implemented, especially as we look at the bioenergy sources, the extent to which every bioenergy source needs to or should go through an analytic process. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of the renewable natural gas that comes from dairy waste. You know, there's a few different projects out there, and we have to establish credit values, and the credit value is going to be so project dependent that the analysis needs to be done, or yeah, that understanding of how beneficial, while certainly a perfect number is always more beneficial than a not perfect number, developing those perfect numbers for every fuel path, for a lot of these are going to be pretty small credit values. So yeah.
Yeah, if I can just respond real quick, I'm not suggesting that we do that or, PUC does that. I'm suggesting that we set up a framework that allows those customized CI values to be done on a project specific basis. If the project developer finds the value in doing that and makes, it's worth it for them to make those changes. And if not, then they simply use the default value. So that's all I'm saying is we're not doing hundreds of different pathways like California has done. Clearly, that's not going to be practical for a state the size of Vermont. But to establish the allowance for that sort of thing to happen organically as the market develops, I think could be useful for incentivizing innovations.
Thanks.
I totally agree with what Floyd just said. And want to add that a significant consideration in implementation will be whether some state agency has the resources to review, approve, validate, verify any pathway specific carbon intensity values. And so that can be a time intensive process depending upon how specific people get. And it has led to substantial issues in implementation of California's LCFS and substantial delays for particular fuel producers. So trying to find the right balance between allowing the innovation to happen, but also making sure that the resources are there to review, approve, validate, and Floyd's suggestion of having the default as a backup to use, would certainly be helpful, but I think we need to provide some recommendations at some point in time about that.
Okay, I'd like to pose a question to Adam. That there is less experience in terms of the wood piece, and from my understanding, the source of wood, and I'll start with wood pellets because that's what I know the most about. There are wood pellets that are produced from whole trees. In fact, Vermont's wood pellet producer, that's what they do. They take white pine and they make pellets out of them. But a large number of pellets that are available in Vermont come from, I use the term mill waste. In other words, these are lumber mills, flooring mills. They're making a wood product, and as the result of them making a wood product, they have material, I'll say leftover, or material they have available they can make wood pellets from. But then there's also, I understand, the pellet producers in the southeastern part of the United States that have they grow their own trees for the purpose of making pellets. And I even told that they may use natural gas to dry the wood product in order to make pellets. So the question to you is, what do you think is the practical limit, or what kinds of categorization of wood that we use for thermal that could have an appropriate carbon intensity value established for it.
In terms of percentage of the average mix?
No, I mean,
Of what's
if you could run
typically
through what you
used
think
in
is
that?
practical in terms of you're differentiating, and you might even want to go to cordwood, is you're differentiating wood that's used for thermal processes. What would you break down those wood sources so that we have the proper differentiation, so that when people are using different kinds of wood, the recognition that those different kinds of wood have different impacts on the overall carbon budget is understandable. I know it's a hard one.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to dig into there and break down, and it depends on timescale and what sort of framework and analysis boundaries you're putting on it. So like the distinctions, you have to draw the boundaries before you can qualify and categorize those feedstocks.
When you say boundaries, you mean geographic boundaries or?
Time, temporal, and spatial.
Yeah. Okay. Brian, do you have an answer for this?
No, of course not.
Oh, damn.
I have an additional complication. As somebody pointed out, advanced wood heat is a clean heat measure. It's not a fuel, but the credit value for clean heat measures are based upon the avoided emissions minus the emissions of what's used instead. But for measures, unlike for fuels, that credit gets assigned over a period of time. So I appreciate this conversation about establishing these credit intensity values and how they might change over time. But for all the clean heat measures that get implemented, the measures are going to get credits over a period of time right up front, the way I understand the legislation. So, as you know, there's not going to be a lot of opportunity for a lot of the work that we're talking about here, beyond establishing defaults. People are not going to, be able to establish a alternative carbon intensity for pellets or wood fuels unless they have it like right off the shelf, because if you're doing an advanced wood heat system, you're going to get those credits based upon whatever the credit value that goes into the rule is going to be. Right.
I guess my thinking though is, are we going to differentiate? Are we going to suggest recommendations? And I already know the answer as soon as I ask this. Somebody puts in a pellet boiler, okay? It makes a difference where they get their pellets from. So are we gonna blend all of our understanding of all the pellets that are burned in the state of Vermont and come up with a single carbon intensity value for pellets? Or is there something else? And maybe, so yeah, as I say, I know the answer to that one already. We're going to have to do a blend. But McNeil expands and uses wood chips to do a district heating system. Do we, that is big enough and will have enough credits associated with it that a thorough understanding of the source of their wood chips is going to lead to a carbon intensity value, and that might change over time.
Right, but the credits get awarded, when the measure is implemented.
On a big project, I'm not sure. I mean, because we can define a big project, you could define the measure because, they may ramp up the number of customers they connect. It may be an annually different on a big project like that.
Maybe, but putting that one aside, I think regarding advanced wood heat, I think one of the points that I was trying to make, it's like you say someone does an advanced wood heat project. Well, depending upon what the score is for biofuels, there may or may not be incentives for people to do that. And
right.
And so and that's that becomes less of a scientific determination and more of a policy choice,
right.
which is kind of odd. And then if you have a fossil fuel system as a customer, then your other, and under the proposal where the customers are going to be the first people who are earning these clean heat credits, are going to own the clean heat credits. So here you have a fuel system, fossil fuel system, and you have a vendor that comes in and says, okay, I can do advanced wood heat for you and it will cost this much, but I'll give you this much back for the credits, or I can do a heat pump system for you and I'll give you this much back for the credits. And how the customer makes their decision is going to be based upon, like, what's the credit value in dollars, not in tons, for each of those things. And so I think this is complicated because there's there's some uncertainty and not clear consensus on some of these emission factors. And then it's additionally complicated because in some ways, this is not really a discussion about what's the quote unquote right number. It's about a policy decision of what is it that we want to have happen in this space. And I think this group, I'm back to where you said, where you started, Ken. We should focus on trying to develop these life cycle emission factors first. It's a complicated enough job. And I've already talked about the second half of this thing, and then I'm talking about this other issue. But these things are out there, but I think those are things for the PUC to decide, because they are more policy related in my mind than they are technical issues.
Okay, Patrick.
And just I'll intervene to say you've got 10 minutes left, about 10 minutes left. I'm going to go tell the other group the same. So to the extent you want to sort of get some clarity around what your next steps are or how you're going to move forward, that's that's the time left.
Yep. Patrick.
And so much of this stuff, I'm trying to figure out ways to simplify for us, because there are so many intricate details to consider. And if we try and consider them all, we'll never get anything done. And so since our job is primarily to provide recommendations to the technical consultants and review their work, I think one recommendation to handle a lot of these issues is that the technical consultant look at the materiality of different choices. So,
and explain that, please.
Yep. So, if going to the advanced wood heating question and Adam's point that, sorry, let me explain it a different way. If things aren't going to have a big impact, I think lots of greenhouse gas programs worldwide, the guidance from the greenhouse gas protocol is to not worry about them, because there is too much variability to get into all the intricate details. So to take an example of that, and to Adam's point about advanced wood heating, cordwood being eligible for certain types of advanced wood stoves, is I think what he was referring to. If there's only going to be 50 of those sold in the state of Vermont, and people are only going to burn 3 cords of wood a year in those, it's not going to have a material impact on reaching the target, nor is it going to have a material impact on Vermont's greenhouse gas inventory. And so, so if it's not going to have a material impact on the greenhouse gas inventory, it's not going to have a material impact on reaching the targets, I think that it's probably reasonable to simplify for the sake of addressing the things that are going to have a material impact. And that's, I think I'd propose as some guidance or advice we could provide.
But I just want to say, Patrick, the example you used, you do realize that cordwood is by far the largest source of thermal biomass used. And
I'm just absolutely just trying to articulate one example to articulate the subject of materiality, and the technical, our advice to the technical consultants could be that they assess the materiality of of all these, of getting into all of the intricate issues. Essentially, intricate issues that are going to have an immaterial impact. I think I'm proposing that they can be excluded. And you have to define what materiality means. Is that 1%, 5%?
Hopefully we get some initial scoping. When we get the list of potential measures, right, then we hopefully get some, maybe a next phase is get some initial scoping. Some of, if the list is really, really long, we're going to want to thin that list down for the more detailed analysis. Yeah. Matthew.
So in the context of a policy question and the complexity of what CI score value you use, I just want to mention again the carbon intensity for the grid as probably being considered by the legislature as one of the primary measure energy sources. The potential study is planning on using the avoided energy supply components report from 2024 for the region of ISO New England. In addition to the upstream value and the methane and other emissions provided in that report to calculate essentially what the displaced carbon savings would be from switching from a fossil fuel to a heat pump, for example, or any other electric heating measure. But the state has different policy positions on the carbon intensity for the grid, depending on what program we're looking at. So the energy efficiency programs use that same value because the savings are larger, essentially, when you use that value relative to efficiency that avoids energy consumption. But the RES, for example, uses the state's portfolio, which is after rec retirements, and therefore has a very different carbon intensity score. So the PUC is going to have to choose what they're going to use for the data source for the carbon intensity for electrification measures. And it's going to have a big impact on the outcome relative to renewable fuels as compared to deployment of electricity for heating. So I think the tag should make a position on which value is appropriate to be used. And it would be great to hear what the commission thinks on that topic as well. Because if possible, if the commission is going to say that we should be using the portfolio value, then ideally we would modify the potential study to reflect that value so we don't have drastically different outcomes.
So I heard a little bit of a cycle there, and I'm not sure where the tag fits in, because the consultants are going to have a carbon intensity value for the grid. So, and they're working for you. So what role do we play to inform their work? And yet the Public Utility Commission, how do we help the Public Utility Commission consider the appropriate carbon intensity value for the grid? I'm not sure what we do here.
It's also an issue of timing because the potential study work is already ongoing. And I'm not sure how, if, for example, the commission did come back and say, oh, we intend to use the portfolio value, how easily the input can be changed, because there may be cascading modeling assumptions that have to be hand manipulated. And it wouldn't just be as simple as modifying the number in an Excel sheet. But I do understand consulting the PUC on the value of measures, for example, the heat pump measure and the emissions savings associated with it based on the use of the electricity compared to burning something else is part of the tag's role. So we were looking at the flow chart earlier with potential schedule items there, and I think May might be too late for the potential study, but would hopefully be a useful time for input from the tag on grid carbon intensity for opinion dynamics work.
Okay, well, I'll raise this during the full meeting because that's probably beyond the scope of what this breakout group can do. But if we need to include that topic for the tag to consider, maybe having a separate group work through that. That's okay. So to the extent that I'm going to be reporting out, I just want to give people a sense of what I'm going to say. First of all, I very, very much appreciate this discussion. I think that our early part was that we will be putting a focus on using life cycle assessment as the basis in which to determine the carbon emissions from the different sources of bioenergy, and a recognition that there has to be follow through, as I think somewhat represented by the Public Service Department memo of a couple months ago, that reconciliation is important in order to feed into the discussion of the group in terms of credit pacing. So that's a topic. I think we're in agreement that we're going to really focus on the life cycle assessment basis on which to evaluate the different sources of bioenergy. And then a significant part of our discussion then is that there is a great deal of work that's being done in other parts of the country with regards to the determination of carbon intensity for the different biofuels. And we want to learn from that. And maybe we'll have Floyd give us a presentation. That's a question I think I'll ask this group. Maybe I should ask the whole group. Should Floyd give a presentation like that to the whole group, or should it be our breakout group? So I'm going to pause and ask this group whether I should pose that to the full group, whether a presentation on the specifics of how the carbon intensity values are determined for specific fuel pathways is accomplished. I'm leaning towards having the full group hear that.
And I might shortcut that conversation by saying that you had people that were not in this group that were very interested in hearing that. So
okay.
I would say
Then I'm going to suggest that we do invite Floyd to give that presentation. And then I'll sum up. Then another piece of our discussion is that we are, looking forward to getting some of the early products from the consultants. Again, while we had discussion about many of the different pathways in terms of bioenergy, it will really help as the consultants provide list of measures, and that list of measures will probably highlight some of the role that the bioenergy assessment needs to take place. And I think, there's so many topics we could discuss. Having those initial products will help us focus so that we can give early feedback to those consultants to make sure that they're covering the aspects that the bioenergy piece needs to address. So before we break up, can you folks, I'm going to also give you all a chance, but are there other things that you think that I should emphasize in terms of the reporting back from this discussion? Yeah, Patrick.
Yeah, just put in another plug for the materiality piece I mentioned. We're just, neither we nor the consultants nor anybody do I think will be able to handle all of the intricacies of all of the pathways. And so consideration to the materiality of the impacts needs to be given.
Right. And is that similar to a sort of a prioritization of the fuel pathways that need more detailed analysis? Is that the materiality? Is that the primary factor that leads to the prioritization of more detailed analysis?
I'm not sure it's the primary factor, but in a lot of these things, there's also like the purpose of assessing materiality is generally to determine whether it's worth the time and effort to consider the intricate details. And so, yeah. Also, there's going to be huge uncertainty to a lot of these things also, but I'll stop because there's 49 seconds and I know.
Yeah, right. So Floyd?
Just real quick, I second the materiality concept. I would frame it as kind of a moving the needle sort of consideration. And as part of that, I think prioritizing pathways that get you the most carbon reductions, in the shortest time frame, I think should be part of that consideration. What we like to call time value of carbon, because ultimately we want to avoid adding more carbon to the atmosphere, because that has a much higher price tag to pay down the road. So if we can get those carbon reductions out now, and in the near term, we're much better off. So I would put in a plug for consideration of getting